Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is an ocean that has no shore. It has no surface and no floor. It does not move with the rhythms of wind or moon, and yet it churns with currents older than the stars themselves. It is not made of water. It is not made of anything that your hands could touch or your eyes could see under normal circumstances. It is made of thought. It is made of feeling. It is made of the raw, unfiltered essence of every emotion ever experienced by every thinking creature that has ever drawn breath anywhere in this galaxy. And for as long as there have been beings capable of wonder, there have been those foolish enough, or brave enough, or desperate enough to try and sail it. This is the warp, the immaterium, the Imperium, the Sea of Souls, the realm of chaos. It has been called 1,000 names by 1,000 civilizations, and not a single one of those names has ever truly captured what it is, because to name something is to define it, and the warp refuses to be defined. It shifts and writhes and contradicts itself with every passing moment, if moments even have meaning in a place where time has abandoned its post entirely. It is the dimension beneath the dimension you know. It is the mirror that does not reflect what stands before it, but instead shows you what you fear most, what you desire most, what you have tried hardest to forget. And buried within its depths, coiled in its impossible currents, and hidden behind veils of screaming light, are things that were old when the first suns of this galaxy still burned young and hot. Tonight, we are going to talk about what the first explorers found when they pushed their ships into that abyss. Not just the human explorers, though we will get to them in great and terrible detail. We are going far, far back. Back before the Imperium. Back before the Emperor walked among mortals. Back before humanity even knew the stars held anything beyond cold light and distant mystery. We are going back to the very beginning, to a time when the warp was something entirely different from the howling nightmare it has become. And then we are going to trace the slow, agonizing path by which it was corrupted, changed, warped, if you will forgive the pun, into the screaming hell dimension that has defined the fate of every thinking species in this galaxy. Because here is the thing that most people miss when they talk about the warp. It was not always like this. The ocean of souls was not always a killing field. There was a time, act so impossibly distant that it makes the entire recorded history of humanity look like a footnote scrawled in the margin of a forgotten book, when the immaterium was calm, when it was still, when it was, by some accounts, almost peaceful, and the story of how it went from that serene state to the frothing, demon-infested hellscape that now threatens to swallow the galaxy whole is one of the most important stories in all of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. It is a story about ambition and consequence, about creation and destruction, about the price that gets paid when beings of immense power start meddling with forces they think they understand but actually do not. And it begins, as all the oldest stories do, with gods. So settle in, get comfortable, let the ambient hum of distant starships and the gentle whisper of void-cooled air carry you along as we descend, layer by layer, into the deepest mystery of the 41st millennium. Because to understand what the first explorers found in the warp, we must first understand what the warp was before anyone found anything in it at all. And to do that, we need to go back approximately 60 million years. Give or take a few geological ages. The galaxy, 60 million years before the current era, was a profoundly different place. The stars burned in configurations that no modern astrocartographer would recognize. The worlds that would one day host the teeming billions of the Imperium of man were still young, many of them still cooling from the violence of their formation, at their surfaces raw and scarred by the growing pains of planetary development. Humanity did not exist, not even in its most primitive, single-celled form. The species that would one day build cathedrals to a god bound to a golden throne that would send armies of genetically enhanced warriors across the stars, that would hold together 1,000,000 worlds through sheer stubborn refusal to die, had not yet taken even its first tentative step onto the long road of evolution. But the galaxy was not empty. Far from it. It teemed with life, with civilizations, with powers that made even the mightiest empires of the 41st millennium look like children playing at kingdoms. And at the pinnacle of all that ancient power sat a species whose name has been almost entirely lost to the grinding erosion of time. We call them the Old Ones. Not because we know what they called themselves, because we do not. That knowledge died with them, or perhaps it fled with them into whatever corner of existence they retreated to when their world came crashing down. We call them the Old Ones because that is all that remains. The knowledge that they were old, older than anything else that walked or crawled or thought in this galaxy, and that they were powerful beyond anything that has existed since. Try to picture them if you can. Cold-blooded beings, probably reptilian in nature, with a patience that bordered on the geological. They did not rush. They did not hurry. They studied the stars with a slow, methodical precision that would have driven a human scientist to madness. And they raised astronomy and the study of alternate dimensions to levels of understanding that the greatest minds of the Mechanicus would weep to glimpse. And they discovered something that would change the course of galactic history forever, though they could not have known it at the time. They discovered the immaterium. Now, when I say they discovered the immaterium, I need you to understand something very important about what that means. The immaterium they found was not the warp you know. It was not the boiling, screaming, demon-haunted nightmare realm that modern imperial scholars describe with terror in their voices and prayer beads clutched in their shaking hands. What the Old Ones found when they first peered beyond the veil of physical reality was something altogether different, something that, by all surviving accounts and fragments of knowledge, was calm. Imagine a vast, still ocean, not the thrashing, storm-tossed seas of some death world, but a deep, quiet body of water stretching out in every direction, its surface smooth as glass, its depths clear and undisturbed. There are currents moving beneath that surface, slow and gentle, driven not by wind or gravity, but by the faint psychic emissions of the life forms scattered across the physical galaxy. Every living thing with a brain, every creature capable of feeling even the simplest emotion, contributed something to this ocean. A thought here, a flash of fear there, a moment of wonder, a pang of hunger, a surge of affection between parent and offspring. All of these experiences, these tiny sparks of consciousness, are drifted like motes of light through the still waters of the immaterium, gathering and dispersing in patterns too subtle and too vast for any single mind to comprehend. There were entities in this ocean even then. The immaterium was not devoid of native life, if life is even the right word for beings made entirely of psychic energy. But these entities were not the ravening horrors that would come later. They were simpler things, formations of emotional resonance that had achieved a kind of dim awareness, drifting through the psychic currents, the way jellyfish drift through terrestrial seas. They were drawn to the brighter concentrations of emotional energy, feeding on them in a passive, almost benign way, and then dispersing back into the background noise of the immaterium. They were not dangerous. They were not malevolent, as they simply were. Formless drifters in a formless sea, as much a part of the immaterium's natural ecology as plankton is a part of Earth's oceans. The Old Ones looked at this dimension and saw opportunity. Immense, staggering, galaxy-shaping opportunity. Because the immaterium, they realized, was connected to the physical universe at every point simultaneously, it underlaid reality like the subfloor beneath a grand cathedral. Every place in the physical galaxy had a corresponding location in the immaterium, and the distance between those corresponding points was far, far shorter than the distance between them in real space. If you could find a way to step into the immaterium at one point and step out at another, you could effectively travel faster than light. Yet you could cross the galaxy in the time it took to walk from one room to the next. The implications were staggering, and the Old Ones, with their patient, methodical approach to problem solving, set about exploring those implications with characteristic thoroughness. And the Old Ones could do exactly that. Their understanding of psychic science was so advanced, so far beyond anything that has existed before or since, that they were able to create stable pathways through the immaterium. Not crude, dangerous translations like the warp jumps that humanity would one day use, throwing their ships into the churning depths and praying they came out the other side in one piece. Number. The Old Ones built tunnels. Stable, permanent, as protected conduits through the immaterium that allowed them to travel from one end of the galaxy to the other with perfect safety and pinpoint accuracy. They called this network of tunnels something that has been lost to history, but the species that inherited it from them, the Aeldari, would come to call it the webway. Picture a web of shimmering pathways threading through the calm waters of the immaterium, each one sealed against the gentle currents outside, each one anchored at both ends by gates set into the surface of worlds scattered across the galaxy. Through these tunnels, the Old Ones moved freely. They visited world after world, seeding them with new forms of life, nurturing existing species toward greater complexity and intelligence, and shaping the ecological destiny of entire planetary systems with the patience of a gardener tending an inconceivably vast garden. They were, by all surviving accounts, relatively benevolent. Not gods, exactly, though they were certainly powerful enough to qualify for that title by any reasonable standard. More like caretakers. Custodians of a galaxy, they considered themselves responsible for shepherding towards some greater destiny that they alone could perceive. And for millions of years, this arrangement worked. The Old Ones traveled their webway, tended their gardens, watched the slow unfurling of evolution on thousands of worlds, and the immaterium remained calm. It remained navigable. It remained, if not exactly safe, at least predictable. The psychic currents flowed in patterns the Old Ones understood, and the native entities drifted in their slow, passive way, never growing large enough or aware enough to pose a threat to anything. The emotional emissions of the galaxy's scattered life forms provided a gentle, steady fuel for the immaterium's existence without destabilizing it. It was, by any measure, a kind of paradise, a golden age not just for the Old Ones, but for the immaterium itself. The Old Ones used this calm immaterium to accomplish things that still defy belief tens of millions of years later. They engineered entire ecosystems from scratch, designing organisms to fill specific ecological niches on worlds they had chosen for cultivation. They manipulated the evolution of promising species, nudging them toward greater intelligence, greater adaptability, greater psychic potential. They built their webway gates on thousands of planets, creating a transportation network that spanned the entire galaxy and made the distances between stars irrelevant. They were, in every meaningful sense of the word, the masters of creation, and they wielded that mastery with a confidence born of millions of years of unchallenged supremacy. But paradise, as every story ever told will remind you, never lasts. And the cracks in this one were about to appear, driven not by any flaw in the immaterium itself, but by the actions of beings who would not rest until they had remade the galaxy in their own desperate, furious image, no matter the cost. The trouble began with the Necrontyr. They were a young species by the standards of the galaxy, mortal and short-lived, accursed by the baleful radiation of their home star, to die painful deaths far before their time. They looked at the seemingly immortal Old Ones and felt a burning, corrosive envy that would shape the destiny of the galaxy for the next 60 million years. They asked the Old Ones for the secret of eternal life, and the Old Ones refused. Whether that refusal was born of genuine wisdom, of caution about sharing dangerous knowledge with a species they deemed too young and volatile to handle it, or simply of a cold-blooded indifference to the suffering of lesser beings, is a question that has never been satisfactorily answered. But the result of that refusal is beyond dispute. The Necrontyr went to war, and in doing so, they set in motion a chain of events that would transform the calm, still ocean of the immaterium into the screaming, demon-infested nightmare that humanity would one day stumble into with absolutely no understanding of what awaited them on the other side. Before we move any further in our timeline, I want to take a moment to linger in the deep waters of the early immaterium, because we have not spent nearly enough time considering what existed there before the corruption began. The entities that drifted through the calm immaterium before the war in heaven are among the least discussed and most fascinating aspects of Warhammer 40,000 lore, and they deserve more attention than a passing mention on our way to the main event. The pre-corruption immaterium was not empty. That much is clear from every source that describes it. But the things that lived there were so fundamentally different from the demons that would come later that using the same word to describe both groups feels almost misleading. The pre-corruption entities were born from the psychic emissions of the galaxy's earliest sentient species, the vague, diffuse emotional output of creatures who were still learning to think, still developing the capacity for complex feeling. These emissions were faint, they were scattered. They lacked the concentrated intensity that would later characterize the psychic output of species like the Aeldari or humanity. And the entities they gave rise to reflected that faintness. Think of them as something between a thought and a cloud. They had no fixed shape. They had no consistent identity. They drifted through the psychic medium the way smoke drifts through still air, coalescing briefly into forms that might have resembled faces or limbs or more abstract shapes, only to dissolve again as the currents shifted. They were drawn to concentrations of emotional energy, the way iron filings are drawn to a magnet, clustering around brighter spots in the immaterium's background radiation and absorbing tiny amounts of energy before drifting away again. They were not intelligent. They were not even really conscious in any way we would recognize. They were more like the immaterium's equivalent of microorganisms. Tiny, simple, reactive things that existed at the very bottom of what you might call the warp's food chain. Some scholars of the Ordo Malleus have theorized that these early entities might have been the precursors of what the Imperium now calls Furies, the lowest and most wretched form of demon. Furies in the current era are things of pure rage and hunger, possessing neither the intelligence nor the self-awareness to serve any of the four great chaos gods. They exist in the formless wastes of the immaterium, the vast, unclaimed spaces between the territories of the four great powers, and they attack anything they encounter with mindless ferocity. But before the corruption of the warp, before rage and hunger became the dominant emotions fueling the immaterium's ecosystem, these entities would have been different, calmer, less defined, less driven. They would have drifted and fed and dissolved in a cycle that was as natural and as harmless as the water cycle on a temperate world. The Old Ones, who studied the immaterium more thoroughly than any other species before or since, appear to have had a sophisticated understanding of these entities and the role they played in the immaterium's ecology. There are fragments of evidence scattered across archaeological sites on dozens of worlds, suggesting that the Old Ones may have even cultivated certain types of warp entity, encouraging their growth and development in the same way they encouraged the growth and development of physical species in the material universe. The purpose of this cultivation, if it occurred, is unclear, as it may have been an attempt to shape the immaterium's psychic currents to make them more amenable to webway construction. It may have been a form of experimentation, an attempt to understand the immaterium's ecology better, or it may have been something else entirely, some purpose so alien to human understanding that we lack even the vocabulary to describe it. What is clear is that the Old Ones were not afraid of the early immaterium or its inhabitants. They interacted with it freely, confidently, with the ease of a species that had spent millions of years studying and understanding the dimension they were exploiting. The calm warp was their ally, their tool, their highway system. It was as integral to their civilization as water is to a maritime culture. And the entities that lived within it were no more threatening to them than the fish in the sea. This is important to understand because it throws into sharp relief just how catastrophic the corruption of the warp truly was. It was not merely a change in the immaterium's character, it was the destruction of an entire ecosystem and its replacement with something fundamentally, irreversibly hostile. The calm warp was not just different from the current warp, it was the opposite of the current warp. And the transition from one to the other was not a gradual evolution, but a violent, traumatic rupture that transformed every aspect of the dimension in a matter of millennia, a period that is mind-bogglingly long by human standards, but vanishingly brief by the standards of galactic history. That the entities that existed before the corruption did not survive it. They were not merely changed by the influx of violent emotional energy. They were consumed by it, absorbed into the growing mass of psychic fury that would eventually coalesce into the first true demons and, millions of years later, into the chaos gods themselves. Whatever those early, harmless, drifting things had been, they were gone, replaced by something that bore no resemblance to them and that would have been utterly incomprehensible to the old ones who had once observed them with such patient, scholarly interest. It is one of the great tragedies of the Warhammer 40,000 universe that the immaterium's original state can never be restored. The corruption is not a disease that can be cured or a contamination that can be cleaned up. It is a fundamental transformation of the dimension's nature, driven by the psychic emissions of every sentient being in the galaxy and sustained by the very act of living and feeling and thinking. As long as sentient life exists in the material universe, the warp will remain corrupted. The calm ocean is gone forever, and the storm that replaced it will rage until the stars themselves go dark. There is a gap in our story that we have glossed over so far, and it deserves attention. Between the end of the war in heaven, approximately 60 million years ago, and the emergence of humanity as a spacefaring species, roughly 15 to 20,000 years before the current era, there is a vast stretch of time during which the warp continued to evolve and change. It is shaped by the psychic emissions of the species that survived the war in heaven and the Enslaver plague. The most significant of these species, at least in terms of their impact on the warp, were the Aeldari. Created by the Old Ones as living weapons against the Necrons, the Aeldari had survived the fall of their creators and gone on to build the most powerful civilization the post-war galaxy had ever seen. Their empire spanned hundreds of thousands of worlds. Their technology was so advanced that even the Imperium of man at its height could not match it, and their psychic abilities were unparalleled, every single Aeldari being a psyker of some degree, their minds burning in the warp with a brightness that dwarfed the psychic output of any other species in the galaxy. For millions of years, millions, the Aeldari were the dominant psychic presence in the immaterium. Their emotions, their thoughts, their dreams and nightmares shaped the warp's currents and influenced the development of its native entities in ways that we can only partially understand. The Aeldari gods, those powerful beings of the immaterium, that the Aeldari worshipped as divine, were at least partially sustained by the psychic energy of their worshippers, their forms and their powers, reflecting the beliefs and values of the civilization that had given them strength. During the early millennia of the Aeldari Empire, when the species was still vibrant and creative and engaged with the universe around it, the warp reflected those qualities. The Aeldari gods of this era were powerful but not malevolent. They represented concepts like craftsmanship, warfare, healing, and knowledge and the natural world. They were sustained by the psychic emissions of a civilization that, while far from perfect, still maintained a basic connection to values and ideals that kept its collective psychic output reasonably balanced. The warp during this period was still dangerous, still corrupted from the war in heaven, still populated by entities that would cheerfully consume an unprotected mortal mind. but it was also shaped, at least in part, by the Aeldari's psychic presence, their collective consciousness acting as a kind of organizing force that imposed some degree of structure on the chaos. This changed as the Aeldari civilization began its long, slow decline into decadence. The timeline of that decline is measured in millions of years, in a descent so gradual that no individual Aeldari could have perceived it happening in their own lifetime. But the cumulative effect was devastating. As the Aeldari turned away from the values and pursuits that had sustained their civilization and toward ever more extreme forms of sensation and self-indulgence, their psychic emissions changed accordingly. The balanced, relatively stable emotional output that had characterized the early empire was replaced by a torrent of excess, of pleasure pursued to the point of pain, and pain pursued to the point of pleasure, of sensations so extreme that they pushed the boundaries of what even an Aeldari mind could experience. And in the warp, something began to stir. The concentrated psychic excess of the Aeldari civilization, accumulated over millions of years, began to coalesce into a new formation. Not a demon in the conventional sense, not a god in the way that the Aeldari's traditional deities were gods. Something new, something unprecedented, a vast, slowly awakening consciousness that was fed not by worship or belief, but by pure, unfiltered sensation, by the raw emotional output of an entire species that had devoted itself to the pursuit of feeling at the expense of everything else. This growing presence would eventually become Slaanesh, the fourth and youngest of the Chaos gods, the prince of pleasure and pain, the being whose birth would destroy the Aeldari Empire and plunge the galaxy into the cataclysm of the Age of Strife. But for millions of years before that birth, the growing presence existed as a shadow in the warp, a gravitational pull on the immaterium's currents that drew more and more psychic energy into its orbit, was growing stronger and more defined with each passing century, each passing millennium, each new generation of Aeldari that pushed the boundaries of sensation a little further than the last. The Orcs, too, played their part in shaping the warp during this long interregnum. Created alongside the Aeldari as another of the Old One's living weapons, the greenskin species had survived the fall of their creators and spread across the galaxy in a tide of violence and destruction that has never fully receded. The Orcs are not psychers in the traditional sense. They do not consciously channel energy from the warp, but they generate a collective psychic field, a gestalt consciousness that grows stronger as more Orcs gather in one place, that can warp reality in their immediate vicinity in ways that defy rational explanation. Yet their vehicles work when they should not, because enough Orcs believe they will. Their weapons hit harder than their crude construction should allow, because the Orcs firing them believe they will. The collective psychic output of the Orc species, pouring into the warp in a steady stream of aggression and enthusiasm and gleeful violence, contributed its own unique flavor to the immaterium's already volatile mixture. In the warp, the psychic emissions of the Orcs coalesced into the twin gods Gork and Mork. These entities are as unlike the Chaos gods as it is possible for warp entities to be. They are not malevolent in the way that Khorne or Nurgle or Tzeentch or Slaanesh are malevolent. They are simply violent, brutally, enthusiastically, joyfully violent, in a way that perfectly mirrors the species that gives them form and power, Gork, who is brutal but cunning, and Mork, who is cunning but brutal, have sat in the warp since the earliest days of the Orc species, wrestling each other, laughing at the universe, and occasionally reaching out to give a particularly entertaining Orc leader a nudge in the right direction. They are proof that the warp reflects the minds that feed it, and that not everything in the immaterium is motivated by the desire to corrupt or consume mortal souls. By the time humanity developed the warp drive and began its first tentative voyages into the immaterium, the warp had been shaped by millions of years of input from these and other species. It was a complex, layered, deeply hostile environment that reflected the full spectrum of mortal emotion, from the Aeldari's refined excess to the orcs' brutal enthusiasm to the scattered, yet faint contributions of hundreds of lesser species, whose psychic output barely registered against the background noise. The four great chaos gods were not yet fully formed, Slaanesh still gestating in the depths of the immaterium, while the other three grew slowly stronger on the steady diet of warfare, disease, and ambition that the galaxy's inhabitants provided. But their presence was felt, if not understood, by those early human explorers who pushed their ships through the veil and found themselves sailing through a dimension that seemed to have opinions about their presence. This is the context that is often missing from discussions of humanity's first encounters with the warp. The immaterium that those first ships entered was not a blank slate. It was a dimension with 60 million years of history, shaped by the psychic emissions of dozens of species, corrupted by a war that had nearly destroyed the galaxy, and populated by entities that ranged from mindless predators to nascent gods. Humanity was not the first species to sail the warp, and it was not the first to discover the horrors that lurked within it. It was simply the latest in a long line of civilizations that had tried to use the immaterium for their own purposes and discovered, too late, that the immaterium had purposes of its own. The war in heaven. Even the name carries a weight that presses down on the mind like a physical force. It is not called the war in heaven because it was fought in any kind of paradise, though the galaxy it ravaged might once have qualified for that description. It is called the war in heaven because the species who remembered it best, the Aeldari, looked back on it with the kind of horrified reverence usually reserved for the battles of gods. And in many ways, that is exactly what it was. A conflict between powers so immense, so far beyond the scale of anything that has happened since, that all the wars of the 41st millennium, all the crusades and heresies and invasions and last stands, would amount to little more than a rounding error in its casualty figures. On one side stood the old ones, masters of the webway, shapers of worlds, custodians of a galaxy they had spent millions of years nurturing towards some unknowable purpose. They had technology that could reshape planets. They had psychic power that could reach across star systems. They had the webway, which gave them the ability to move their forces anywhere in the galaxy instantaneously, while striking and withdrawing before the enemy could respond. On the other side stood the Necrontyr, burning with resentment and armed with a hatred that transcended mere anger, a species-wide bitterness toward the universe that had given them short, painful lives while their neighbors seemed to live forever. But the Necrontyr alone were not enough to challenge the old ones. Their technology was advanced, yes, but the old ones' mastery of the immaterium gave them advantages that raw technology simply could not match. The Necrontyr were pushed to the edge of the galaxy, their empire crumbling, their people fracturing into warring factions that fought each other almost as viciously as they fought the old ones. It looked, for a time, like the war might end before it truly began. With the Necrontyr collapsing under the weight of their own internal divisions. And then the Necrontyr found the Satan. The Satan were something else entirely. They were beings of pure energy, vast and ancient, predating even the old ones by billions of years. They had existed since the earliest moments of the universe, feeding on the radiation of young stars, drifting through the cosmos in a state of mindless, primal hunger. They were not intelligent, not in any way that we would recognize. They were more like forces of nature than living things. Cosmic parasites of incomprehensible scale, drawn to energy the way a moth is drawn to flame. But the Necrontyr changed that. They gave the Satan physical bodies, shells of living metal called necrodermis that focused and concentrated the Satan's diffuse energies into coherent, terrifyingly powerful forms. And with those bodies came something the Satan had never possessed before: awareness, intelligence, will, and hunger directed not by instinct, but by conscious, calculating malice. The alliance between the Necrontyr and the Satan transformed the war overnight. The Necrontyr now reforged as soulless metal constructs called Necrons through the terrible process of biotransference, became an army that could not be killed, could not be broken, could not be stopped by any conventional means. They felt no pain. They knew no fear. They could be shattered into pieces and reassemble themselves, their living metal bodies flowing back together like liquid mercury. And the Titan, now fully conscious and armed with powers that could extinguish stars, while turned their terrible hunger toward the living galaxy with a focused intensity that the Old Ones had never faced before. The Old Ones began to lose, slowly at first, then with gathering speed. The Titan's mastery of the physical universe countered the Old Ones' mastery of the immaterium. The Necron's endless metal legions ground down the Old Ones' organic armies through sheer, relentless attrition. The Necrons breached the webway itself using newly invented dolmen gates, assaulting the Old Ones in their most sacred and supposedly impregnable strongholds. Worlds fell, star systems were consumed, entire civilizations that the Old Ones had spent millions of years cultivating were wiped out in the span of decades, their populations harvested by the Titan to feed an appetite that knew no satisfaction. Desperate, cornered, watching their empire crumble after millions of years of stability, the Old Ones turned to the one advantage they still possessed: the immaterium. Their mastery of psychic science had always been their greatest weapon, and now, with their backs against the wall, they used it in ways they had never attempted before. They began to engineer new species, designed from the ground up to be living weapons against the Necrons and the Titan. These species were given an unusually strong connection to the immaterium, their minds attuned to psychic energies in ways that made them natural conduits for the power of the warp. Among these engineered species were the ancestors of the Aeldari, designed to be the most psychically gifted of all, or their souls burning with a brightness in the immaterium that would have made them devastating weapons against the soulless Necrons. And there were others, the Krork, the ancestors of the Orcs, engineered to be green-skinned engines of violence whose collective psychic field could bend reality in ways that defied explanation. The Jokairo, whose instinctive mastery of technology bordered on the supernatural. And more, species whose names have been lost entirely, whose existence is known only through the faintest echoes in the archaeological record. But here is where the story takes its darkest turn. Because in creating these psychically gifted species, in seeding the galaxy with millions upon millions of minds that burned bright in the immaterium, the Old Ones did something they had not anticipated, something that could not be undone, or as something whose consequences would ripple forward through 60 million years of history and still be shaping the fate of the galaxy in the 42nd millennium. They disturbed the calm of the warp. Remember that still, quiet ocean we talked about earlier? The one that had drifted in peaceful equilibrium for millions of years, its currents gentle, its native entities harmless, its waters clear and navigable. Now imagine what happens when you pour billions of gallons of raw, volatile fuel into that ocean while simultaneously striking a match. Because that is essentially what the Old Ones' creations did to the immaterium. The psychic emissions of these new species were not like the faint, gentle contributions of the galaxy's previous inhabitants. They were loud, they were intense, they were charged with the raw, unfiltered emotions of young, violent, frightened species that were being born into a galaxy consumed by the most devastating war it had ever known. War, pain, fear, rage, despair, hatred, the desperate, clawing will to survive in a universe that seemed determined to destroy everything. All of these emotions poured into the immaterium in quantities it had never experienced before, and the effect was catastrophic. The calm waters began to churn. The gentle currents became riptides, then maelstroms. The ambient psychic energy, once evenly distributed and harmless, began to concentrate into dense, volatile knots of emotional resonance that pulsed and throbbed with something that looked increasingly, unmistakably, like intent.
Honestly, this is the part of the lore that gets me every single time, because when you really sit with it, the warp is not just some sci-fi hyperspace mechanic slapped onto the setting to explain how ships get from A to B. It is the setting. Every single major event in 40K traces back to this one dimension and what lives inside it. The heresy happens because of the warp. The Emperor is stuck on the throne because of the warp. And the Imperium is the way it is because of the warp. Take it out and the whole universe just collapses into generic space opera. And what I personally find so compelling about it is that the horror is not random. It's earned. The old ones made choices. Humanity made choices. And the warp is the receipt for all those choices coming due at once. But anyways, that's just my take on it. Let's go back to the video.
The native entities of the immaterium, those harmless, drifting formations of psychic energy, began to change. The influx of violent, yet painful emotions warped them, twisting their simple awareness into something darker, something more aggressive, something that craved the very emotions that were reshaping them. They grew. They fed on the flood of psychic pain pouring in from the material universe, and with each feeding, they became more defined, more powerful, more aware. The dim, passive creatures that had drifted through the calm immaterium for millions of years were being transformed into predators, into monsters, into the very first demons. The warp was being corrupted, not by some external force, not by some malevolent intelligence with a grand design, but by the unintended consequences of actions taken in desperation by beings who should have known better. The old ones, in their frantic attempt to win a war they were losing, had poisoned the very dimension they depended on. They had turned their greatest tool into their greatest enemy, and the emerging horrors of the newly corrupted immaterium did not discriminate between the forces that had created them and the forces they had been created to fight. The once calm sea had become a storm, and that storm would never end. What emerged from the newly corrupted immaterium was not a single type of entity. It was an entire ecosystem of psychic horrors, each one shaped by the specific emotions that had given it form, each one hungry for the energy that sustained it, each one capable of interacting with the material universe in ways that had never been possible before. The boundaries between the immaterium and reality, once firm and well-defined, it had been weakened by the sheer volume of psychic energy being pumped back and forth between the two dimensions. The walls were thinning, and through those thinning walls, things were beginning to reach. But among all the horrors birthed by the corruption of the warp, one species stood out as particularly devastating. They were called the Enslavers, and they represented something that had never existed before in the galaxy's long history. A warp entity that could not only reach into the material universe, but establish a permanent foothold there. A creature that could seize control of a psyker's mind, dominate it completely, and then use that controlled mind as a living gateway through which more of its kind could pour into reality. They were, in the most literal sense imaginable, a weaponized feedback loop. And each successful possession created the conditions for more possessions, which created the conditions for even more. It was exponential horror, and it spread across the galaxy with the speed and inevitability of a wildfire in a drought-stricken forest. The process was as efficient as it was terrible. An enslaver would drift through the immaterium until it detected the psychic signature of a living psyker in the material universe. These signatures were not hard to find. The old ones' engineered species burned like bonfires in the warp, their minds broadcasting their presence to anything with the ability to perceive it. Once a suitable host was located, the enslaver would establish a parasitic mental bond with that unfortunate individual, gradually overwhelming their consciousness over the course of a few days. And the possessed psyker would show no outward signs of what was happening to them, at least not initially. They would continue to function normally, going about their daily activities while their mind was slowly, irresistibly consumed from within. And then, when the enslaver's control was complete, the psyker would begin to change physically. Their body would swell and distort, their flesh becoming translucent, their bones shifting into impossible configurations, as though something inside them was rearranging the fundamental architecture of their body to make room for new arrivals. In the span of hours, the psyche would be transformed into a living warp portal, a screaming, writhing gateway through which more enslavers could enter the material universe and begin the cycle again with new hosts. The possessed individual was gone by that point, their consciousness obliterated, their body reduced to nothing more than a doorway, wearing the rapidly disintegrating remnants of a human shape. Once established on a world, the enslaver population could grow with geometric speed. They were not limited to possessing psyches. Once enough of them were present in reality, they could extend their mental control to non-psychic individuals as well, dominating entire populations, entire civilizations, entire worlds. A single enslaver could be the seed that consumed a planet. A handful could consume a star system. And in the chaos of the war in heaven, with psychically gifted species being born and dying in the millions across the galaxy, there was no shortage of minds for them to consume. The Enslaver Plague was the final catastrophe in a long series of catastrophes, and it struck the Old Ones at the worst possible moment, when they were already reeling from the Necron's advance and struggling to maintain their grip on the webway and their remaining territories. Their own creations, the psychically gifted species they had engineered to fight the Necrons, became the vectors through which the enslavers spread. The webway was breached from within the immaterium as enslavers poured through weakened sections of its walls. Several webway gates were destroyed by the Old Ones themselves in desperate attempts to prevent the infestation from reaching unaffected worlds, but it was like trying to stop a flood by blocking individual streams, while the river itself was overflowing its banks. Trapped between two unstoppable forces, the Old Ones shattered. Their civilization, which had endured for millions of years, it crumbled in what was, by their standards, the blink of an eye. Whether they went extinct or fled the galaxy entirely is unknown. What is certain is that their era was over, and the galaxy they left behind was a devastated wasteland. The Satan, weakened and now threatened by the Enslaver Plague themselves, began to retreat. The Necrons, led by the silent King Zarek, turned on their Satan masters in a final act of self-preservation, shattering the star gods into fragments and sealing those fragments away in prisons of living metal. Then the Necrons withdrew into their tomb worlds and entered a hibernation that would last for 60 million years. They sealed their tombs, activated their sentinel constructs, and vanished from the galaxy's stage, leaving it to whatever life managed to survive the Holocaust they had helped create. And the warp was forever changed. The calm, still ocean that the Old Ones had discovered and exploited was gone. In its place was a roiling, churning maelstrom of violent psychic energy, its currents laced with malice, its depths populated by entities that fed on suffering and rage. The seeds of the Chaos Gods had been planted, though it would take millions of more years, and the psychic contributions of billions of additional sentient beings before those seeds would grow into the four great powers that would come to define the warp. But the corruption was irreversible. The immaterium had crossed a threshold from which there was no returning. This was the state of the warp when the first human explorers arrived on the scene, tens of millions of years later. Not the calm ocean that the Old Ones had discovered, but a corrupted, a hostile dimension that had already consumed one galactic civilization and would be more than happy to consume another. The paradise was dead. The nightmare had begun. And humanity, blissfully ignorant of everything that had come before, was about to stick its hand directly into the mouth of the beast. Now we leap forward in time, tens of millions of years forward, past the slow recovery of the galaxy's biosphere, past the rise of the Aeldari and their eventual dominance of the stars, past the long, quiet centuries during which the Necrons slept in their tombs and the warp settled into its new chaotic patterns. We arrive at a period that Imperial historians call the Age of Technology, though they sometimes refer to it with a bitter irony as the Dark Age of Technology. Dark not because it was a time of ignorance, but because so much of the knowledge from that era has been lost, that it might as well have taken place in perpetual night. Humanity, by this point, had crawled out of its cradle on Terra and was reaching for the stars. The first interstellar voyages were conducted using conventional propulsion systems, sublight drives that pushed ships through the void at speeds that, while impressive by planetary standards, were miserably slow when measured against the distances between star systems. Reaching the nearest habitable world could take generations. Entire lifetimes were born and consumed aboard the vast generation ships that carried humanity's first colonists to distant stars, families who would never see the world they were traveling toward, their children and grandchildren picking up where they left off, maintaining the ship, attending the engines, preserving the knowledge and the hope that had launched the voyage in the first place. It worked, after a fashion. Humanity spread, not quickly, not efficiently, but with the stubborn, grinding persistence that has always been the species' greatest strength. Colony worlds were established, outposts of human civilization scattered across the galaxy, like seeds thrown into a field. Most of these colonies were isolated from the start, separated from each other and from Terra, by distances so vast that communication between them was measured in centuries. Each one developed independently, following its own evolutionary and cultural path, adapting to local conditions in ways that would eventually produce the bewildering variety of human civilizations the Emperor would encounter during the Great Crusade thousands of years later. But sublight travel had its limits, and those limits were absolute. You cannot build an interstellar civilization when your fastest ships take decades or centuries to reach their destinations. You cannot maintain trade, culture, or political unity across distances that make round-trip communication a multi-generational affair. Humanity needed something faster, and sometime around the 18th millennium, some unknown genius or team of geniuses working in some long-forgotten laboratory found it. They found the warp, or rather they found a way to use it. The theoretical existence of the immaterium had been known for some time before the breakthrough occurred. Human scientists had detected the faint psychic emanations that leaked through the barrier between dimensions. They had mapped the strange energy signatures, built theoretical models, argued about implications. But it was one thing to know the warp existed, and quite another to figure out how to use it for practical purposes. The breakthrough came with the invention of the warp drive. The exact mechanism of this device has been lost, like so much else from the age of technology. What is known is that it worked by piercing the barrier between real space and the immaterium, allowing a starship to slip through the gap and enter the warp. Once inside, the ship could use its conventional engines to travel through the immaterium's currents, i.e. covering in days or weeks distances that would have taken years or decades in real space. And when it reached the corresponding point in the immaterium for its intended destination, it could activate the warp drive again, punching back through into normal space. The invention of the warp drive was, without exaggeration, the most important technological breakthrough in human history. What had once taken generations now took weeks. The isolated colony worlds were suddenly within reach. Trade became possible. Communication became practical. A genuine interstellar civilization began to take shape for the first time. But the warp drive alone was not enough. Because the warp that humanity found when they first pushed their ships through the dimensional barrier was not the calm ocean that the old ones had exploited. It was the corrupted, a hostile, demon-infested nightmare that the war in heaven had created. And the first human ships to enter the immaterium discovered this fact in the most terrible way imaginable. Alongside the warp drive, humanity developed the Geller field. This device created a bubble of real space around the ship, essentially wrapping it in a shell of normal physics that kept the madness of the warp at bay. Inside the Geller field, the laws of the physical universe still applied. Space had 3 dimensions. Time moved forward. Cause preceded effect. Outside the Geller field, nothing made sense. The entities of the warp, which existed entirely outside the laws of normal physics, could not breach the boundary where the field met the immaterium. Without the Geller field, Entering the warp was a death sentence. Not a quick, clean death either. The kind of death that involved your ship being torn apart molecule by molecule, while entities of pure malice consumed your crew's sanity before moving on to their souls. The kind of death that could leave a ship drifting through the warp for centuries, its hull intact, but its corridors filled with the remains of things that had once been human and were now something else entirely. Even with the Geller field, the early days of warp travel were extraordinarily dangerous. The first warp jumps were short, cautious affairs, covering no more than 4 or 5 light years at a time. The navigational methods available were crude, relying on mathematical calculations performed in real space that could only predict the warp's currents from the outside. Once a ship was actually inside the immaterium, it was flying blind. The crew had no way of knowing whether they were on course, no way of detecting the shifts and eddies that could throw them light years off target, no way of predicting the temporal distortions that could make a journey of 3 days in the warp last 3 years in real space, or vice versa. Ships disappeared, frequently. A small but significant percentage of every vessel that entered the warp simply never came back. Some were lost to Geller field failures. Some were caught in warp currents that carried them far from their intended destinations. Some were caught in temporal anomalies, emerging from the warp decades or centuries after they had entered it. And some, the ones that no one liked to talk about, came back changed. Their hulls intact, their systems functional, but their crews gone or worse, are still present but no longer entirely human, their minds and bodies warped by exposure to the raw stuff of the immaterium in ways that defied medical explanation and resisted all attempts at treatment. These early explorers were the pioneers of warp travel. They pushed into the immaterium, knowing that they might never return, driven by curiosity, by greed, by the simple human desire to see what lay beyond the next horizon. And what they found in those first terrifying journeys would shape humanity's relationship with the immaterium for the next 30,000 years. The early centuries of warp travel were a period of extraordinary danger and equally extraordinary discovery. Ships went into the immaterium and sometimes came back with reports that defied rational explanation, or crews described experiences that no language was equipped to convey, sensations that had no analogue in the physical world, sights that the human brain was simply not designed to process. And while the Geller field kept the worst of the warp's horrors at bay, it could not entirely insulate the people inside from the dimension they were traveling through. Even on the smoothest voyages, crews reported nightmares of unusual intensity that clung to the mind long after waking hallucinations that manifested in peripheral vision and vanished when looked at directly, feelings of being watched by something vast and attentive that existed just beyond the boundaries of perception, something that knew your name and seemed to find the knowledge amusing, a persistent, a low-grade unease that settled over the ship like a fog the moment it entered the warp and did not lift until it emerged back into the clean light of real space. But the biggest problem remained navigation. Without a way to see the warp from the inside, ships were limited to short, calculated jumps based on observations made before they entered the immaterium. Anything beyond 4 or 5 light years was a gamble, and the longer the jump, the worse the odds became. The warp's currents shifted and changed constantly, and what had been a clear channel yesterday might be a churning maelstrom today. Humanity needed eyes inside the warp. It needed someone who could look into the immaterium without going mad and chart a course through its treacherous currents in real time. The answer came in the 22nd millennium, roughly 4,000 years after the invention of the warp drive, and it came in the form of a mutation, or perhaps an engineered genetic modification. The records from this period are fragmentary and contradictory, and scholars have argued for millennia about whether the navigators arose naturally or were deliberately created through genetic engineering techniques common during the age of technology. What is certain is that they appeared, and their appearance changed everything. The navigators, formerly classified as Homo navigo, were a distinct subspecies of humanity, distinguished by a single, unmistakable feature: a third eye, positioned in the center of the forehead that granted them the ability to perceive the immaterium directly, while normal humans who looked into the warp experienced only madness and death. Their minds shattering under stimuli they were not designed to process, navigators could open their warp eye and see the currents of the immaterium with clarity and precision. They could perceive the flows and eddies of psychic energy the way a river pilot perceives currents. They could detect storms in time to alter course. They could chart a path through chaos with precision that no mathematical calculation could match. With navigators aboard, ships could make jumps of up to 5,000 light-years. Journeys that had once been impossible became routine. The navigator would sit at their station, open their warp eye, and guide the ship through the immaterium's currents, the way a skilled sailor guides a vessel through treacherous waters, reading the tides, adjusting course, avoiding the worst of the storms, and riding the favorable currents to maximize speed and minimize danger. The navigators organized themselves into family units called houses, their genetic lineage carefully maintained through intermarriage to preserve the warp eye mutation. Because the navigator gene was recessive and would be lost if a navigator bred with a normal human, the houses became insular and clannish, focused on preserving the purity of their bloodlines with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Over the centuries, this careful inbreeding produced a wide variety of secondary mutations. Navigators tended to be tall and thin, with pale, almost translucent skin. Their regular eyes were often unusually large and sometimes lacked irises entirely, giving them a blank, unsettling stare. Their facial features could be indistinct, as though the genetic template that defined human had become blurred. Some had webbed hands and feet. Others had skin bearing a faintly scaled texture. Others still were completely hairless. And as they aged, accumulating decades and centuries of exposure to the warp through their open third eye, the mutations grew more pronounced. The warp eye itself would change, its iris and white gradually disappearing until nothing remained but a hard, staring orb of solid black. The navigator's body would begin to shift, growing larger, stranger, as though the constant exposure to the immaterium was slowly reshaping their physical form into something that belonged more to the warp than to the material universe. The eldest navigators, those who had guided ships for 400 years or more, were often barely recognizable as human at all. They were the heirs apparent, the most powerful of their kind, beings whose connection to the warp was so deep that they could perceive its currents with an accuracy that bordered on prescience. But the mutations were considered a fair price. A skilled navigator could sense warp entities before they became a threat. They could detect shifts in the immaterium's currents that warned of approaching storms. And their warp eye, when turned on a living being, could kill with a burst of raw warp energy that seared the soul from the body. This ability was rarely used, and navigators kept their third eye covered at almost all times. But it served as a potent reminder that the navigators were not simply useful, they were dangerous. The navigator houses became some of the wealthiest and most powerful institutions in human civilization, a status they have maintained for over 30,000 years. Their monopoly on safe warp navigation gave them leverage that no other organization could match. Without navigators, interstellar trade ground to a halt. Without navigators, military fleets could not deploy. Without navigators, the fragile threads that held human civilization together would snap. The houses knew this, and they guarded their position with a jealous ferocity that would persist through the age of technology, the age of strife, and the entire span of the Imperium's existence. And so, armed with the warp drive, the Geller field, and the navigators, humanity surged out into the galaxy. The age of technology reached its zenith. Billions of worlds, trillions of people, as technologies so advanced that the Adeptus Mechanicus of the 41st Millennium would classify them as holy relics if they could even understand what they were looking at. It was a golden age, a time when humanity seemed poised to become the galaxy's dominant species. But the warp was patient, and the warp had not forgotten what humanity was doing every time a ship pierced the barrier between dimensions and sailed through its corrupted depths. So what did they actually encounter? Those first brave or reckless souls who pushed their ships through the dimensional barrier and sailed into the immaterium. What did they see? What did they feel? What greeted them on the other side of reality? The answer depends on who you ask and when you ask them. Because the warp is not a fixed environment. It does not have a geography in any meaningful sense, or it does not have landmarks, or stable features, or consistent conditions. A ship entering the warp at one point and another ship entering at the same point 5 minutes later might have completely different experiences. The immaterium is responsive in a way that no physical environment is. It reacts to the minds of those who enter it, reflecting their emotions, their fears, their desires back at them in forms as varied as the minds that generate them. No two voyages through the warp are exactly alike. But certain common elements appear again and again in the accounts of warp travelers across every era of human history, and from these we can assemble a picture, however incomplete, of what those first explorers found. The first and most universal observation was the light, or rather the absence of it in any familiar form. The warp has no stars. It has no sun. It has no natural source of illumination in any conventional sense. And yet it is not dark. It is lit by a diffuse, sourceless radiance that shifts constantly in color and intensity, cycling through spectrums that have no names in any human language. Some travelers describe it as a deep, bruised purple, like the sky above a thunderstorm that covers the entire world. Others describe it as a sickly, yellowish green, the color of infection. Still others describe bands and curtains of vivid, almost painful color that sweep across the void like aurora effects, scaled up to cosmic proportions. The colors were not merely visual, they were emotional. Travelers consistently report that the colors of the warp carry feelings with them, the way sound carries vibration. A field of deep red does not merely look red. It feels angry. It feels like rage pressed into visible form, and the longer you look at it, the angrier you become. A wash of sickly green does not merely look unwell. It feels like despair, like hopelessness, like the bone-deep certainty that nothing will ever be right again. The warp does not merely show you things, it makes you feel them, whether you want to or not. The second observation was the texture of the medium itself. The warp is not empty space. It is not a vacuum. It is dense, almost liquid, filled with a kind of psychic medium that the ship must push through, as though traveling through an extremely thick atmosphere. Early crews described the sensation of the ship slowing and speeding up seemingly at random, as though the medium itself was resistant in some places and accommodating in others. Through viewports shielded by the Geller field, they could see the medium swirling and eddying around the hull in patterns that were hypnotic to watch and deeply unsettling to contemplate, because the patterns were not random. They had a deliberateness to them, a suggestion of intentionality that implied the medium was not merely reacting to the ship's passage, but actively responding to it, studying it, testing it, looking for weaknesses. The third observation, and the most disturbing, was the sense of presence. Every crew that has ever traveled through the warp has reported the overwhelming feeling of being watched, not casually observed, watched with intense, focused, deeply personal attention, as though whatever was doing the watching knew exactly who you were, exactly what you feared, as exactly what secrets you kept buried in the deepest corners of your mind. The feeling persisted for the entire duration of the voyage, growing stronger or weaker in waves that seemed to correspond to the ship's proximity to whatever entities lurked in the surrounding medium. At its worst, the sensation could be paralyzing, reducing experienced spacefarers to shaking, weeping wrecks. And then there were the visions. Travelers frequently report seeing structures in the warp, vast formations of crystallized psychic energy that take the form of towers, fortresses, cathedrals, cities, entire landscapes, all of them constructed on a scale that defies comprehension, and all of them fundamentally wrong in ways that the human brain struggles to articulate. The geometry is off. The proportions are impossible, as angles that should be acute are somehow obtuse and right-angled simultaneously. Surfaces that appear flat from one angle reveal impossible depths from another. These structures appear and disappear in the medium, rising up from the depths before sinking back into the chaos. Travelers also report seeing faces. Not always human faces, though human faces are the most common. Faces formed from the swirling psychic medium itself, enormous and terrible and ancient, looking out from the depths with expressions that range from mindless hunger to knowing, malicious amusement. Some of these faces speak, though the words do not travel through sound. They appear directly in the minds of those who see them, bypassing the ears entirely, manifesting as thoughts that are clearly not the listener's own. The content almost always falls into one of two categories: temptation or threat, sometimes both at once. The entities themselves were the most dangerous element. They came in almost infinite variety, from tiny darting things that flickered at the edges of perception to vast, slow-moving presences that could be sensed rather than seen, filling the medium with a pressure that was psychic rather than physical. Some ignored the ships entirely, drifting past with the indifference of deep-sea creatures. Others showed keen predatory interest, circling the Gellerfield's perimeter with the patient persistence of sharks. And some, the largest and most powerful, responded to the ship's presence with attacks that tested the Gellerfield's integrity to its absolute limits. These entities were the demons, or more precisely, the lesser denizens of the warp, the countless nameless things that existed below the attention of the great powers, but were still more than capable of destroying an unprotected ship. Each one was a reflection of some aspect of mortal emotion, a fear made flesh, a desire given teeth, an anger condensed into a form that could reach out and tear. There were stranger discoveries too. The warp was not entirely hostile. Scattered through the chaos were channels of relatively calm, stable energy that ships could follow to make their journeys faster and safer. These warp channels were well-established routes that remained relatively consistent over time. Many connected major star systems, forming the basis of primary trade and military routes. Who created these channels remains a mystery, though many scholars suspect they are remnants of the Old One's original manipulation of the immaterium. There were also the warp gates, pairs of connected points in real space linked by stable tunnels through the immaterium, allowing instantaneous travel between them without any of the normal risks. The gates were rare and many were defective, but they represented something remarkable, evidence that the warp could be tamed, at least in isolated pockets, and used safely under the right conditions. But perhaps the most significant discovery was not any specific phenomenon or entity. It was the slowly dawning realization that the warp was alive. Not biologically, but in a deeper, more fundamental way. The immaterium was responsive. It was aware. It reacted to mortal minds the way a body reacts to an infection, with attention, but with focused energy, with something that looked increasingly like intent. The warp was not merely a medium through which ships traveled. It was a place, a realm, a dimension with its own laws, its own inhabitants, its own agenda. And that agenda was not friendly. Many of these early superstitions about protection during warp travel would eventually evolve into the formal rituals and prayers of the Imperial Creed. The roots of faith as a shield against the darkness can be traced back to those first terrified crews who discovered that believing hard enough in their own protection actually seemed to help. Not always, not reliably, but sometimes in ways that defied scientific explanation but were too consistent to dismiss. This realization would take thousands of years to fully crystallize, and by the time it did, it would be far too late to do anything about it. We cannot talk about what the first explorers found in the warp without talking about the forces that shaped the dimension they were entering. Even if those forces were not yet fully formed at the time of humanity's first warp voyages. The Chaos Gods, the four great powers of the Immaterium, are not simply inhabitants of the warp. they are the warp, or at least the most significant and most powerful expressions of it. Their presence defines the character of the immaterium in the same way that the sun defines the character of a solar system. Everything in the warp exists in relation to them, shaped by their influence, drawn into their orbits, colored by their natures. Horn was the first to achieve something approaching full consciousness. Though the concept of first is meaningless in a dimension where time does not function linearly. Horn is the blood god, the lord of skulls, the embodiment of rage and violence, and the savage joy of killing. He was born from the accumulated psychic residue of every act of violence ever committed by every sentient being in the galaxy, from the war in heaven onward. Every battle, every murder, every moment of blind, red fury that has ever gripped a thinking mind has contributed to Horn's power. He does not care who fights or why. He does not distinguish between righteous anger and mindless savagery. He cares only that blood is spilled and skulls are claimed, and every drop of blood and every skull feeds his insatiable hunger. In the warp, Horn's domain manifests as a vast, a blood-soaked wasteland centered around a throne of brass that sits atop a mountain of skulls so vast that it defies measurement. The realm of Khorne is a place of eternal warfare, where armies of demons clash in battles that have no beginning and no end, fighting for the sheer pleasure of fighting, dying and being reborn in an endless cycle of violence that perfectly mirrors the emotion that sustains them. The rivers that flow through Khorne's domain run red with blood, literal rivers of the stuff, collected from every battlefield in every dimension across the entirety of existence. The air smells of copper and ozone, the scent of fresh blood and discharged energy weapons, and the only sound is the clash of metal on metal, the roar of war cries, and the screams of the dying. When the first human explorers entered the warp, as they would have passed through regions of the immaterium that were influenced by Khorne's growing presence, they would have felt the rage, even through the Geller field. They would have noticed crew members becoming shorter-tempered, more aggressive, more prone to outbursts of anger that seemed disproportionate to their causes. Fights would have broken out over minor grievances. Discipline would have eroded. The ship's atmosphere would have taken on an edge of hostility that no one could explain, but everyone could feel. These were the first, faint stirrings of Khorne's influence, reaching through the Geller field's protections to touch the minds of the mortals passing through his nascent domain. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, the architect of fate, was born from the collective psychic energy of ambition, hope, desire for change, and the pursuit of knowledge. Every scheme ever hatched, every plan ever laid, every moment of desperate hope in the face of impossible odds has fed Tzeentch's power. He is the most intellectually active of the Chaos Gods, the one most likely to engage with mortal minds in ways that go beyond simple predation. Where Khorne simply devours, Tzeentch manipulates. He offers knowledge to those who seek it, power to those who crave it, and change to those who have grown weary of the way things are. His gifts always come with strings attached, and those strings are woven into plans within plans within plans that extend across millennia and touch every corner of the galaxy. In the warp, Tzeentch's domain is the Crystal Labyrinth, an impossible maze of crystallized psychic energy that changes configuration constantly, as its passages rearranging themselves in response to the thoughts and intentions of anyone who enters them. The labyrinth contains all knowledge, past, present, and future, locked away in crystal libraries guarded by demons that are as likely to share what they know as they are to devour the seeker. At the center of the labyrinth sits the impossible fortress, Tzeentch's seat of power, a structure that cannot be described because it has no fixed form, changing its architecture from moment to moment in accordance with its master's ever-shifting whims. Early warp travelers influenced by Tzeentch's presence would have experienced strange effects on their cognition. Crew members would have reported sudden flashes of insight, moments of clarity in which complex problems seemed to solve themselves, or hidden patterns in seemingly random data became visible. These insights would have been seductive, offering genuine advantages to those who acted on them, but they would also have been the first tendrils of a trap. Each insight accepted, each piece of knowledge embraced, would have drawn the recipient deeper into Tzeentch's web, subtly reshaping their perception of the world until they began to see patterns and conspiracies everywhere, even where none existed. Nurgle, the Plague Father, the Lord of Decay, was born from the psychic energy of despair, of resignation, of the weary acceptance that comes when a being has suffered so much that they have lost the will to resist. Every plague that has ever ravaged a world, every disease that has ever consumed a body, at every moment of hopelessness, in the face of inevitable decline, has fed Nurgle's power. But Nurgle is not merely a god of disease. He is a god of endurance, of continuity, of the stubborn persistence of life, even in its most degraded forms. His followers do not merely suffer. They accept their suffering, embrace it, find a twisted kind of peace in the knowledge that decay is the natural state of all things, and that resistance is not merely futile, but unnecessary. Nurgle's domain in the warp is the garden, a vast, festering landscape of rot and renewal that stretches beyond sight in every direction. In the garden, every form of disease and decay is represented in vivid, nauseating detail. Plants grow, bloom, rot, and grow again in cycles that take seconds rather than seasons. Pools of stagnant, disease-laden water bubble and steam, their surfaces alive with organisms too small to see and too numerous to count. The air is thick with spores and pollen and the sweet, cloying smell of decomposition, and the ground squelches underfoot with a wetness that is warm and organic and deeply, fundamentally wrong. The first explorers who passed through regions of the warp influenced by Nurgle would have experienced a creeping lethargy, a subtle but persistent weariness that sapped their motivation and dulled their senses. Crew members would have found it harder to care about their duties, harder to maintain the discipline and vigilance that warp travel demanded. Minor ailments, the colds and aches and skin irritations that are a normal part of life aboard a starship, would have seemed worse than usual, lingering longer and responding less readily to treatment. Yet the ship's atmosphere would have taken on a damp, organic quality that no amount of environmental control could fully eliminate. And then there was Slaanesh, the youngest of the four, the one who would not achieve full consciousness until the fall of the Aeldari near the end of the 25th millennium. But even before Slaanesh's birth, the growing presence in the warp that would become the Prince of Pleasure and Pain was already influencing the immaterium's character, adding an undertone of excess and sensation to the psychic medium that early human travelers would have detected as a subtle but persistent pull on their desires. Crew members would have found themselves drawn to sensory experiences with unusual intensity, finding food more flavorful, music more moving, physical sensations more vivid, and as though the warp were amplifying their capacity for experience in ways that were initially pleasant, but gradually became overwhelming. This pull toward excess, this amplification of sensation, was the faintest echo of the power that would one day be born in the screaming psychic cataclysm of the Aeldari's fall. Together, these four influences shaped the warp that the first human explorers encountered. They gave it its character, its moods, its personality, if a dimension of psychic energy can be said to have a personality. The warp was not merely hostile. It was hostile in specific ways that reflected the specific emotions that had given it form. It raged like Horn. It schemed like Tzeentch. It decayed like Nurgle. It tempted like the growing shadow that would become Slaanesh. And it did all of these things simultaneously, at layering influence upon influence in combinations that were different for every ship, every crew, every individual who dared to enter its domain. The first explorers sailed through all of this without understanding any of it. They felt the rage and did not know its name. They experienced the strange insights and did not recognize their source. They fought the lethargy and did not understand what was causing it. They wrestled with the amplified desires and could not explain why the warp seemed to make everything feel more intense. It would take millennia of experience and the hard-won wisdom of countless crews who went into the warp and emerged, changed, before humanity began to develop even a rudimentary understanding of the forces that shaped the dimension they depended on for survival. That understanding remains incomplete to this day. The warp is too vast, too complex, too fundamentally alien to be fully comprehended by mortal minds. But the partial understanding that the Imperium has assembled over the course of 30,000 years is enough to confirm what those first explorers suspected from the very beginning of their journeys into the immaterium. The warp is alive, it is aware, it has intentions, and those intentions are not kind. There is an aspect of early warp exploration that deserves its own dedicated discussion, because it speaks to something fundamental about the nature of the immaterium and the way it interacts with mortal minds. We have talked about what the first explorers saw, we have talked about what they felt, but we have not talked about what they heard. The warp has sounds, not sounds in the physical sense, not vibrations traveling through a medium and striking the eardrum, because the warp has no physical medium, and the Geller field would filter out any physical vibrations even if it did. What the warp has are psychic impressions that the human brain interprets as sound, the same way it interprets other warp phenomena as colors or shapes or the feeling of being watched. These psychic sounds are as varied and as disturbing as everything else about the immaterium, and they have been reported consistently by warp travelers since the earliest days of human interstellar exploration. The most commonly reported sound is a low, continuous hum, described by some as similar to the background noise of a large industrial facility, and by others as resembling a distant choir singing in harmonies that are almost but not quite recognizable. As this hum is present on virtually every warp voyage, persisting from the moment of translation into the immaterium until the moment of re-emergence into real space. It is generally considered harmless, though prolonged exposure to it has been linked to insomnia, anxiety, and a persistent feeling of unease that can take days or even weeks to fade after the voyage ends. Tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, who have studied the phenomenon, have been unable to identify any physical cause for the sound, and have been forced to classify it as a psychic artifact, an unavoidable side effect of mortal minds existing in close proximity to the immaterium. But the hum is only the baseline. Layered on top of it, audible during moments of heightened warp activity, or when the ship passes close to entities or phenomena of particular intensity, are other sounds that are far more disturbing. Whispering is the most frequently reported, a constant, barely audible susurrus of voices speaking in languages that the listener almost but never quite recognizes. The whispers seem to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. They fade when you try to focus on them and grow louder when you stop paying attention. Crew members who have been exposed to them for extended periods sometimes report that they begin to understand individual words, then phrases, then complete sentences, though the content of these communications is invariably disturbing, usually consisting of personal secrets that the listener has never shared with anyone, or prophecies of future events that are frighteningly specific and almost always involve the listener's death. There are also screams, not always, and not on every voyage, but often enough that experienced warp travelers have learned to recognize them as a sign of approaching danger. The screams are not human, or at least not entirely human. They carry undertones and overtones that no human vocal apparatus could produce, frequencies that should be inaudible to the human ear but somehow register anyway, bypassing the physical mechanism of hearing entirely and imprinting themselves directly on the listener's consciousness. Some scholars have theorized that these screams are the psychic echoes of souls being consumed in the warp, the final, agonized emissions of mortal minds being devoured by the entities that inhabit the immaterium. Others believe they are the voices of the demons themselves. They're their natural form of communication rendered as sound by brains that have no other way to process the input. And then there is the music. This is the rarest and, in many ways, the most terrifying of the warp's auditory phenomena. Described by those who have heard it as hauntingly beautiful, impossibly complex, and utterly alien, the music of the warp has been reported by a small but consistent percentage of travelers throughout the entire history of human warp exploration. It does not sound like any music produced by any known culture. It does not follow any recognizable scale or rhythm. And yet, those who hear it describe it as the most beautiful thing they have ever experienced, a sound so profoundly moving that it brings tears to the eyes and fills the heart with a longing so intense that it is physically painful. Yet the music is dangerous. Not because of any direct psychic attack associated with it, but because of its effect on the listener's behavior. Those who hear the warp's music often become obsessed with it, spending hours sitting in silence, straining to hear it again, neglecting their duties, their health, their relationships, everything that had previously given their lives meaning, in favor of the desperate hope that they might catch one more fragment of that impossible melody. In extreme cases, listeners have been known to attempt to open airlocks or disable Geller fields in order to get closer to the source of the sound, driven mad by a beauty that was never meant for mortal ears. The early explorers did not understand what they were hearing. They lacked the conceptual framework to interpret these psychic sounds as communications from or manifestations of the warp's native entities. Many attributed them to malfunctions in their ship's audio systems, to interference from the warp drive or the Geller field generator, to the stress and sleep deprivation that were inevitable consequences of extended warp travel. It was only later, as humanity's understanding of the immaterium slowly deepened, that the true nature of these phenomena became clear. The sounds were not malfunctions, they were the warp talking, and the warp had a great deal to say. One of the most disorienting and dangerous aspects of warp travel, and one that the first explorers discovered almost immediately, is the immaterium's relationship with time, or rather, its complete lack of one. In the physical universe, the time flows in a single direction at a rate that is, for all practical purposes, constant and predictable. Causes precede effects. Events occur in sequence. The past is fixed and the future is uncertain. These are not merely human perceptions, but fundamental properties of the physical universe, as immutable as the speed of light or the gravitational constant. They are the bedrock on which all of physics, all of chemistry, all of biology, all of civilization is built. In the warp, none of this applies. Time in the immaterium is not merely distorted, it is absent. The concept of before and after has no meaning in a dimension where past, present, and future exist simultaneously, where events that have not yet happened in the material universe have already occurred in the warp. And events that occurred billions of years ago are still happening, playing out in eternal loops that have no beginning and no end. The warp does not experience time as a linear progression. It experiences all of time, all at once, in a single, eternal, overwhelming now. For ships traveling through the warp, this means that the relationship between the time spent in the immaterium and the time that passes in the material universe is essentially random. A ship that enters the warp at one point and exits at another might find that a journey that took 3 days in the immaterium took 3 weeks in real space, or 3 months, or 3 years, or 3 centuries. The temporal dislocation is unpredictable and often dramatic, and it has been the source of some of the most bizarre and tragic incidents in the history of human interstellar travel. There are documented cases of ships entering the warp and emerging before they left, arriving at their destinations days or weeks before their departure was even scheduled. These temporal paradoxes are rare, but they have occurred often enough to be considered a known hazard of warp travel. The Imperium has no explanation for them beyond the understanding that the warp does not respect the arrow of time, and that ships traveling through its currents can sometimes be swept backward along temporal flows that have no analogue in the physical universe. There are also documented cases of ships entering the warp and not emerging for centuries. Their crews preserved in a state of temporal stasis by the immaterium's chaotic relationship with time. When these ships finally translate back into real space, their crews are often shocked to discover that the worlds they left behind have aged generations in what felt like days. The civilizations they knew have risen and fallen. The languages they spoke have evolved beyond recognition. The people they loved have been dead for longer than anyone can remember. These temporal castaways are among the most pitiable figures in the Imperium, stranded not just in space, but in time, exiled from their own era by the warp's casual disregard for the rules that govern existence in the material universe. The early explorers discovered the temporal madness of the warp almost immediately, and it terrified them in ways that the other hazards of warp travel did not. The demons were frightening, yes, but they were also comprehensible. They were predators. They wanted to consume you. You could fight them, or at least you could try. The temporal effects of the warp were something else entirely. You could not fight time. You could not negotiate with it. You could not see it coming or predict when it would strike. You could enter the warp on a routine supply run and emerge to find that everyone you had ever known was dead of old age, that the world you had left behind had been conquered and reconquered a dozen times, that the language you spoke was now classified as a dead tongue studied only by scholars and antiquarians. The psychological impact of this uncertainty was enormous. Every warp jump, no matter how short, was carried with it the knowledge that you might emerge into a universe that had moved on without you. Every translation into the immaterium was a small act of faith, a willingness to trust that the currents of the warp would carry you to your destination in something resembling the right time frame. And every re-emergence into real space was accompanied by a moment of intense, almost paralyzing anxiety as the crew checked their chronometers and their communications and tried to determine just how much time had passed in the outside universe while they were sailing through a dimension where time itself had gone mad. The general rule of thumb, established through millennia of experience, is that 1 day in the warp corresponds to roughly 12 days in real space. But this ratio is a rough average, not a reliable constant. An individual voyages can vary wildly from this baseline, and the longer the voyage, the greater the potential for temporal dislocation. Short jumps of a few light years are relatively predictable. Longer jumps become increasingly unreliable. And jumps of several thousand light years, the kind that require a navigator to guide the ship through the deep currents of the immaterium, can produce temporal outcomes that defy any attempt at prediction. This temporal unreliability is one of the primary reasons that the Imperium of Man, despite its vast size and its desperate need for rapid communication and coordination, operates with a level of bureaucratic inefficiency that would be comical if the stakes were not so high. Orders issued from Terra can take years or decades to reach their intended recipients. Reports from the frontier can arrive at the Imperial Palace long after the events they describe have been rendered irrelevant by subsequent developments. Military reinforcements dispatched to a besieged world can arrive to find the siege resolved, for better or worse, generations before they got there. The Imperium is, in a very real sense, an empire at war with time itself, fighting not just the physical enemies that threaten its borders, but the temporal distortions that make it impossible to coordinate the defense of a realm that spans 1,000,000 worlds. The first explorers could not have known that their initial, tentative voyages into the warp would lead to all of this. They could not have anticipated that the dimension they were learning to navigate would, over the course of 30,000 years, has become the single greatest source of uncertainty, danger, and confusion in human history. But the seeds were planted in those first voyages, in those first moments of temporal dislocation, in those first shocked and disoriented crews, checking their chronometers and discovering that the universe had moved on without them while they were away. We have mentioned the Geller field several times in this narrative, and we have spoken of its importance in protecting ships from the horrors of the warp. but we have not yet fully explored what happens when that protection fails. And we should, because the stories of Gellerfield failures are among the most harrowing in all of Imperial history, and they represent, in their purest and most undiluted form, the answer to the question of what the first explorers found in the warp. As when the Gellerfield drops, the warp does not merely intrude upon the ship, it devours it. The accounts of Gellerfield failures are, understandably, rare. Most ships that suffer a complete Gellerfield collapse in the warp are never heard from again. They simply vanish, added to the long and ever-growing list of vessels classified as lost in transit, their crews listed as missing presumed dead, their cargo written off, their names eventually forgotten by everyone except the families who wait in vain for ships that will never return. The few accounts that do exist come from ships that suffered partial or temporary Gellerfield failures, ships where the field flickered or weakened for a few seconds or minutes before being restored, and allowing a brief but devastating incursion of warp energy and entities into the ship's interior before the protective barrier was re-established. These accounts are consistent in their horror. The moment the Gellerfield drops, reality within the ship begins to break down. The laws of physics, which had been maintained by the field's projection of real space, cease to apply. Gravity fluctuates wildly, crushing crew members to the deck in one corridor while leaving them floating in zero gravity in the next. Light behaves erratically, bending and splitting in ways that turn familiar corridors into funhouse mazes of distorted perspectives and impossible shadows. Temperature swings between extremes. Rooms flash freezing in an instant, while adjacent compartments become furnaces hot enough to melt plasteel. Or the ship's structure itself begins to warp, bulkheads bowing and twisting as the metal responds to psychic forces that have no physical analog, corridors stretching and compressing, doorways opening onto rooms that did not exist moments before, familiar passages leading to destinations that should not be possible. And then the entities arrive, not gradually, not tentatively, but all at once, a flood of warp stuff pouring through every gap in the ship's compromised defenses like water through a broken dam. The demons that have been circling the Gellerfield for the duration of the voyage, testing its boundaries, probing for weaknesses, suddenly find that the barrier they have been pressing against for days or weeks has vanished. They do not hesitate. They do not pause to assess the situation. Or they rush in with a hunger and a fury that is beyond anything the crew has ever experienced, and they begin to feed. The crew dies quickly, but not quickly enough. The demons are not interested in simple killing. They are interested in experience, in sensation, in the psychic energy that is released by mortal minds in the grip of extreme emotion. Fear is the richest feast, and so the demons take their time, drawing out the terror of their victims, appearing in forms calculated to maximize the psychological impact of their presence. A crew member who fears fire finds themselves confronted by a demon wreathed in flames that burn but do not consume. A crew member who fears drowning finds the corridor filling with a liquid that looks and feels like water, but is actually condensed psychic energy, thick and warm and impossibly heavy, and are pressing down on them with the weight of all the fear they have ever felt. Every crew member's worst nightmare is given form and substance, tailored specifically to them, designed to produce the maximum possible output of psychic terror before the demon finally, almost reluctantly, ends their life and consumes whatever remains of their soul. Those who survive a partial Gellerfield failure, the lucky few who were in sections of the ship that retained some protection or who were rescued before the demons could reach them, are rarely the same afterward. The psychological trauma of witnessing the warp unfiltered, of seeing reality break down around them and watching their crewmates consumed by entities that should not exist, leaves scars that no amount of therapy or conditioning can fully heal. Many survivors become catatonic, and their minds simply shutting down in the face of experiences too extreme to process. Others develop severe psychotic disorders, their perception of reality permanently altered by their brief exposure to the immaterium. Still others appear to recover, but are subtly changed. Their personalities shifted in ways that their friends and family struggle to articulate, but cannot ignore, as though some essential quality of their humanity was consumed during the incursion and replaced with something that looks similar but is fundamentally different. The Imperium classifies all survivors of Gellerfield failures as potential security risks and subjects them to extensive screening by the Inquisition. A disturbing percentage of these survivors are found to have been tainted by their exposure to the warp, as carrying within them seeds of corruption that may take years or decades to manifest but will, eventually, bloom into something dangerous. The Inquisition's response to such findings is predictably harsh. Survivors found to be tainted are executed, their bodies are burned, their names are struck from imperial records. It is as though they never existed, which, from the Inquisition's perspective, is preferable to the alternative of allowing a potential vector for chaos corruption to walk free among the Emperor's subjects. The frequency of Geller field failures has increased significantly since the opening of the Great Rift. The turbulence of the modern warp places greater strain on Geller field generators than they were designed to handle, and the resources needed to maintain and repair these critical systems are in shorter supply than ever. Ships that once might have traveled for decades without a Geller field issue are now experiencing failures on a regular basis. The Adeptus Mechanicus has been working frantically to develop improved Geller field technology, but progress has been slow, hampered by the usual combination of bureaucratic inertia, superstitious resistance to innovation, and the simple fact that the fundamental principles underlying the Geller field are not fully understood, even by the tech priests who maintain and repair the devices. The Geller field failure remains the single most feared event in the life of any Imperial spacefarer. It is the nightmare that keeps void-born populations awake in their bunks, the scenario that training drills are designed to prepare for, but that no amount of training can truly prepare you for. It is the ultimate demonstration of the warp's power and humanity's vulnerability, the moment when the thin barrier between the familiar world of physics and the nightmare dimension of the immaterium is stripped away, and the true nature of what lies outside is revealed in all its terrible glory. When we talk about what the first explorers found in the warp, we should remember that the most honest answer is this: they found a dimension that wanted to get inside their ships and consume their souls, and the only thing standing between that dimension and its meal was a thin shell of projected reality powered by technology that nobody fully understood. That was true when the first ship entered the warp 15,000 years ago, and it is true today. The technology has improved, the understanding has deepened. The prayers have gotten longer, but the fundamental equation has not changed. The warp is on one side, humanity is on the other, and the Geller field is the only thing keeping them apart. No discussion of what the first explorers found in the warp would be complete without addressing the fate of those who went in and never came back, or came back wrong, or came back centuries after they were expected, or came back as something other than what they were when they left. The warp collects ships the way a spider collects flies, not all at once, not every time, but steadily, relentlessly, over the course of millennia, building a collection of lost vessels that is scattered throughout the immaterium like debris in a planetary ring. These lost ships, caught in the warp's currents and unable to escape, can drift through the immaterium for centuries or millennia, their hulls intact, but their crews long dead or worse. Some are frozen in temporal pockets, preserved in perfect condition, their corridors lit, their systems functioning, their crew quarters still bearing the personal effects of men and women who died before the current millennium began. Others are warped beyond recognition, their hulls twisted and fused with other vessels or with the raw psychic matter of the immaterium itself, becoming hybrid structures that are neither ship nor warp entity, but something horribly, impossibly both. The Imperium has a name for these lost vessels. It calls them space hulks, and they are one of the most feared phenomena in all of Imperial space. A space hulk is formed when multiple ships, lost at different times and in different locations, are brought together by the warp's currents and fused into a single, enormous, drifting mass. The process can take centuries or millennia. The warp slowly accumulating vessels the way a river accumulates debris against a sandbar, pressing them together with psychic forces that weld metal and plasteel as effectively as any forge. The result is a massive, labyrinthine structure that can be the size of a small moon, a conglomeration of ships from different eras, different civilizations, different species, all crushed and melted and twisted together into a single horrifying whole. Space hulks drift through the warp like dead leviathans, yet carried by currents that bring them, periodically, into contact with the material universe. When a space hulk translates out of the warp and into real space, it becomes a target of intense interest for the Imperium, because the vessels that make up its mass may contain valuable technology, raw materials, or information that could be of enormous strategic value. But they are also intensely dangerous, because the long exposure to the warp that created them has almost invariably attracted inhabitants. Genestealers, those terrifying biological advanced scouts of the Tyrannid hive fleets, are particularly fond of space hulks, using them as mobile nesting sites from which they can infest any world the hulk approaches. But genestealers are not the only things that call space hulks home. Orc pirates use them as mobile fortresses. Chaos cultists establish shrines in their twisted corridors. And the warp entities that cling to the hulk's surface and inhabit its darkest recesses make every boarding action a potential encounter with the demonic. The first explorers could not have imagined that the ships they were losing in the warp would eventually become these monstrous, drifting amalgamations of metal and madness. They thought they were simply losing ships, a painful but ultimately manageable cost of doing business in a hostile dimension. They did not realize that the warp does not merely destroy the things it takes. It preserves them, it reshapes them, it incorporates them into its own chaotic ecology, using them as building material for structures that will drift through the immaterium for eternity, carrying within them the ghosts of crews that died screaming thousands of years ago, and the echoes of battles that were lost before the current age of the Imperium even began. Every lost ship is a monument to the price of warp travel. Every space hulk is a graveyard, a museum, and a warning all at once. And every time one translates out of the warp and into real space, it brings with it a piece of the immaterium itself, a fragment of the nightmare dimension that has been shaped by centuries of exposure into something that is both material and immaterial, both ship and warp entity, both the product of human engineering and the creation of psychic forces that no human engineer could control. The Golden Age could not last. It never does. And the seeds of its destruction had been planted long before humanity even discovered the warp drive, and sown by forces that operated on timescales so vast that individual human lifetimes were invisible to them. Throughout the age of technology, something had been changing in the galaxy's psychic environment. The Aeldari, descendants of one of the Old One's engineered species, and by far the most psychically gifted race in the galaxy, had built an empire that spanned the western regions of the Milky Way. Their civilization was ancient and sophisticated, their mastery of psychic science rivaled by no other living species. But the Aeldari had a fatal flaw. Their connection to the warp, the very thing that made them so powerful, also made them vulnerable to its influence in ways that other species were not. Every emotion they experienced resonated in the immaterium with an intensity orders of magnitude greater than the psychic emissions of less gifted species. And the Aeldari had grown bored. Over the millennia, their civilization had turned inward, pursuing ever more extreme forms of sensation in an attempt to stave off the ennui that seemed to be the inevitable consequence of near immortality. Their pleasures became darker, their entertainments became crueler, their appetites expanded beyond decadence into territory that could only be described as depraved, and every moment of that depravity poured into the warp like fuel being pumped into a furnace. Something was growing in the immaterium, something vast and terrible, coalescing from the concentrated psychic emissions of an entire civilization's descent into hedonistic madness. As it had been growing for millennia, a slow accumulation of excess and desire gradually achieving critical mass. It did not yet have a name. It did not yet have full consciousness. But it was stirring, and its stirring was sending ripples through the warp that were being felt across the entire galaxy. For humanity, the first signs of trouble appeared around the 25th millennium. Psychers, humans born with the ability to channel psychic energy from the warp, had always existed in small numbers. But suddenly, with terrifying abruptness, that changed. Psychers began appearing on every human world in numbers that dwarfed anything seen before. Millions, billions. People who had been born normal were manifesting psychic abilities seemingly at random, their minds opening to the warp like flowers opening to the sun. On the more progressive worlds, these new psychers were initially welcomed. They were studied, protected, encouraged. The potential benefits seemed immense. Humanity appeared to be evolving. But the optimism did not last. Because the newly emerged psychers were not just conduits for psychic energy, they were beacons in the warp, their minds burning bright in the immaterium like signal fires on a dark shore. And the things that lived in the warp were drawn to those fires with the single-minded intensity of predators drawn to prey. The possessions began almost immediately. Psychers who lacked training or mental discipline became vulnerable to the entities of the warp. A demon would latch onto their open mind, consuming their personality from within, overwriting their consciousness with something ancient and hungry and utterly inhuman. At and through the possessed psycher's mind, the demon could reach into the material universe. It could manifest physically. It could touch and tear and destroy. Worlds fell. Entire civilizations that had survived for millennia were consumed in weeks as demonic entities poured through the minds of possessed psychers and laid waste to everything around them. The populations died screaming, their deaths feeding the very entities that had caused them. The worlds that survived were the ones that had been least welcoming to psychers. The regressive, superstitious worlds that had burned their witches and stoned their seers came through relatively intact. The progressive worlds that had protected their psychers were almost universally destroyed. The irony was brutal, and it left a scar on humanity's collective psyche that has never fully healed. And it is the reason the Imperium of the 41st millennium treats psychers with such fear and suspicion. And then the warp storms came. Across the galaxy, the immaterium erupted. Massive disturbances threw up barriers of churning psychic energy that cut off entire regions from each other. Travel through the warp became impossible. Communication ceased. The fragile web holding human civilization together was severed in an instant, and the species fragmented into billions of isolated, terrified, vulnerable populations scattered across a hostile galaxy. This was the Age of Strife. 5,000 years of darkness, violence, and regression. 5,000 years during which humanity forgot what it had been. Technologies that had been commonplace became mysterious, then sacred, then lost entirely. On worlds that had been part of a galactic civilization became isolated islands surrounded by barbarism. On Terra itself, civilization collapsed entirely. The great cities crumbled. The knowledge of millennia was lost. Warlords carved out petty kingdoms among the ruins. Terra became a hellscape, a world of constant war and grinding poverty. The Golden Age was over, and the price of reaching into the warp, of using that corrupted dimension without fully understanding what lived there, had been paid in full. Out of the ashes of the Age of Strife, a figure arose on Terra. A being of immense psychic power, who had walked among humanity for thousands of years, guiding it from the shadows, watching its progress with the patience of an immortal, who understood that the path to greatness was measured in millennia, not decades. And he had many names over the long course of his existence, but the one that would endure was simple and absolute: the Emperor. The Emperor had watched the Age of Strife unfold with growing urgency. He had seen the Golden Age crumble. He had watched human worlds burn as demons poured through the minds of untrained psychers. He had witnessed the warp storms sever the bonds that held civilization together. and he had known, with the certainty of a being who could see further into the future than any other living creature, that worse was still coming. The growing presence in the warp, the thing coalescing from the Aeldari's psychic excess, was approaching critical mass. When it achieved full consciousness, it would be born in a cataclysm that would shake the galaxy to its foundations. But the Emperor also knew that this birth would create an opportunity. The psychic shockwave of the new god's emergence would, briefly, quiet the warp storms. There would be a window, a narrow opening during which the Emperor could act. He had been preparing for this moment for thousands of years, laying plans within plans, building the foundations of what would become the most powerful human empire ever to exist. On Terra, he had fought his way to dominance, conquering the warring techno-barbarian states and unifying the human homeworld under a single banner. He had forged alliances with the Mechanicum of Mars, the tech priests who had survived the Age of Strife by turning the worship of technology into a religion that preserved knowledge even as it mystified it. He had created the Space Marine Legions, 20 armies of genetically enhanced super soldiers led by 20 Primarchs, beings of such staggering power and capability that they were, in many ways, the Emperor's own sons made flesh to serve as humanity's greatest champions. And he had two answers to the problem of the warp, two solutions to the existential threat that the immaterium posed to humanity's survival and future. The first was the Astronomican. This was a colossal psychic beacon, powered by the Emperor's own mind and amplified by the continuous sacrifice of thousands of psykers, that projected a beam of psychic light into the warp from Terra. The Astronomican served as a reference point for navigators, a fixed star in the chaos of the immaterium that they could use to orient themselves during warp travel. Without the Astronomican, a navigator looking into the warp saw nothing but churning, featureless chaos, with no way to determine direction or distance. With the Astronomican burning its steady golden light in the depths of the immaterium, navigators could take bearings, calculate positions, and guide their ships through the warp with a precision that had never been possible before. The Astronomican did not make warp travel safe. Nothing could make warp travel safe. The warp was still hostile, still unpredictable, still populated by things that wanted nothing more than to consume every living soul that dared enter their domain. But the Astronomican made warp travel manageable. It turned the suicidal gamble of early warp navigation into something that could be relied upon, at least most of the time. Yet ships could now travel from one side of the Imperium to the other with reasonable confidence that they would arrive at their intended destination within a reasonable time frame. And for a species that depended entirely on interstellar travel for its survival, most of the time was enough. The second solution was more ambitious, more dangerous, and ultimately more tragic. It was called the Webway Project. The Emperor had discovered the Aeldari Webway, that network of stable tunnels through the warp that the old ones had originally created millions of years ago, and the Aeldari had inherited and expanded. These tunnels allowed instantaneous, perfectly safe travel between any two connected points, bypassing the dangers of the open warp entirely. The Emperor's plan was to build a gate into the Webway from Terra, using an ancient device called the Golden Throne to create and maintain the connection, and then expand human access to the Webway until it could replace warp travel entirely. If the Webway project succeeded, humanity would no longer need to enter the warp at all. The Navigators, the Geller Fields, the entire terrifying apparatus of warp travel would become unnecessary. Human ships would travel through the sheltered corridors of the Webway, moving from world to world with the speed and safety of someone walking through a well-lit tunnel. And without the constant need to interact with the warp, the influence of the Chaos Gods on humanity would be dramatically reduced. The Emperor believed this project could sever humanity from the warp's influence permanently, while starving the Chaos Gods of the human psychic energy that helped sustain them, and freeing the species from the shadow that had hung over it since the first ship entered the immaterium all those millennia ago. the Emperor began work on the Webway project in secret, retreating from the Great Crusade that was reuniting the scattered worlds of humanity and locking himself away beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra. Not even his Primarchs knew what he was doing. The secrecy was necessary, he believed, because the Navigator houses would have fought the project with every resource at their disposal if they learned it would make them obsolete. The Paternova of the Navigators even dispatched an agent to destroy a prototype device called Dark Glass that was connected to the project. But the secrecy bred resentment among his sons, particularly Horus, who felt abandoned by the father he worshipped and could not understand why the Emperor had left the Great Crusade at its most critical juncture. The human-built sections of the Webway were different from the original Aeldari tunnels. The Aeldari tunnels were constructed from a psychically inert material that formed an impenetrable barrier against warp entities, keeping the interior of the tunnels completely safe from the immaterium that surrounded them. The Emperor did not have access to this material. Instead, he used his own immense psychic power, channeled through the Golden Throne, to maintain a constant psychic ward around the human tunnels, holding back the warp through sheer force of will. It was an extraordinary feat of psychic engineering, but it had a critical weakness. Thus, the wards were only as strong as the mind that maintained them. If anything disrupted that mind's concentration, even for a moment, the wards would fail and the warp would rush in. It worked, for a time. Thousands of Mechanicum workers labored in the new tunnels, extending them, reinforcing them, building the infrastructure that would eventually connect Terra to the wider Webway network. The Emperor sat on the Golden Throne, his mind focused on maintaining the wards, his power the only thing standing between the workers and the demons that pressed hungrily against the tunnel walls from the outside. It was a delicate, precarious balance, a testament to the Emperor's almost unfathomable power, but also a reminder of how much depended on a single point of failure. And then Magnus the Red, what with the best of intentions and the worst of outcomes, destroyed everything. Magnus was one of the 20 Primarchs, and by far the most psychically gifted of all of them. He was a scholar, a seeker of knowledge, a being whose curiosity about the workings of the universe was as boundless as his power. When he learned, through his own sorcerous divinations, that Horus had been corrupted by chaos and was planning to betray the Imperium, Magnus was desperate to warn the Emperor. Normal astropathic communication was too slow and too unreliable. The message was too urgent, too important, too catastrophic in its implications to be entrusted to the normal channels. So Magnus did what Magnus always did when confronted with a problem that conventional methods could not solve. He used sorcery. The ritual he performed was immensely powerful, far beyond anything a normal psyker could have attempted. It punched through the psychic wards protecting the Imperial Palace with the subtlety of a battering ram, and in doing so, it shattered the delicate protections the Emperor had placed around the human Webway tunnels. The wards that had been holding back the warp from the tunnels cracked and fell like glass struck by a hammer, and through those cracks, the demons came pouring in. Thousands of Mechanicum workers were slaughtered in minutes. The corridors that had been filled with the sounds of construction and progress were suddenly filled with screaming, with the shriek of reality being torn apart, with the laughter of things that had been waiting for exactly this moment for as long as the tunnels had existed. And the Custodian Guard and the Sisters of Silence were thrown into a desperate battle to prevent the demons from reaching the Golden Throne and, through it, the surface of Terra itself. The Emperor was forced to abandon the Webway project entirely and devote his full psychic power to holding the warp portal closed, a task that consumed him so completely that he could barely communicate with the outside world, let alone direct the response to Horus's rebellion. The Webway project was dead. Humanity's best chance to free itself from the warp's influence, to escape the endless cycle of dangerous warp travel and the slow corruption of chaos, was gone forever. And the Emperor, mortally wounded in his final confrontation with Horus aboard the traitor's flagship at the climax of the heresy, A would spend the next 10,000 years pinned to the Golden Throne, his decaying body sustained by ancient technology that even the Adeptus Mechanicus no longer fully understood. His mind bent to the twin tasks of powering the Astronomican and keeping the warp portal beneath the Imperial Palace sealed shut against the demons that still pressed against it after all those millennia. The price of reaching into the warp, of trying to use its power and its pathways for humanity's benefit, had been paid once again. And this time, the bill was the Emperor himself. For 10,000 years after the heresy, the Imperium endured. It did not thrive. It did not progress. It stumbled from crisis to crisis, held together by faith, by force, and by the sheer stubborn refusal of the human species to lie down and die. The warp remained hostile. Ships still disappeared in its depths. Demons still breached the barrier between dimensions, claiming worlds and populations with the casual cruelty of children pulling wings off insects. But the Imperium survived, because the Astronomican still burned, and the Navigators could still use its light to guide their ships, and the Geller fields could still hold back the worst of the warp's horrors for long enough to get from one star system to another. But the warp was not static. It was growing more turbulent, more hostile, more active with every passing century. The Chaos Gods, fully awake and fully formed, were playing their great game, an eternal conflict between the four great powers of the immaterium that produced shockwaves in the material universe every time one faction gained an advantage over the others. Warp storms became more frequent and more severe. The Eye of Terror, the massive warp rift created by the birth of Slaanesh at the end of the Age of Strife, pulsed with an energy that seemed to grow stronger over time, as though the wound in reality was not healing but actively widening. And then, at the close of the 41st millennium, the wound split open entirely. The Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, a tear in reality that stretched from the Eye of Terror in the galactic west to the Hadex anomaly on the eastern fringe, ripping across the galaxy like a jagged scar across the face of existence itself. It was the single most catastrophic event since the birth of Slaanesh, and in many ways it was worse, because while the birth of Slaanesh had calmed after the initial cataclysm, the Great Rift showed no signs of healing, and no signs of stabilizing, no signs of doing anything other than roiling and expanding and pouring the raw energy of the warp into the material universe in quantities that defied comprehension. The causes of the Great Rift are debated by every faction in the galaxy. The destruction of Cadia and its ancient Necron-built blackstone pylons, which had helped hold the Eye of Terror in check for millennia, is considered the primary trigger. When Abaddon the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade shattered Cadia and destroyed those pylons, it removed the last anchor holding the warp at bay in that region. Some scholars believe Abaddon had been strategically destroying worlds rich in blackstone over the course of 10,000 years, with the annihilation of Cadia as the final, deliberate trigger for a chain reaction that would tear the galaxy apart. But other events contributed to the catastrophe. The sorcery of the demon primarch Magnus the Red during the Thousand Suns invasion of the Fenris system, disruptions in the webway, the partial awakening of Iniad, the Aeldari god of the dead, the sundering of Craftworld Biel-Tan, mass bloodshed in the Damocles Gulf, the resurrection of the Primarch Reboot Gilliman, dozens, perhaps hundreds of events, large and small, all converging in a moment of cosmic alignment that no single mind could have predicted or controlled. The effects were immediate and devastating. The Great Rift split the Imperium in two. On the Terran side, in the region that came to be called the Imperium Sanctus, the Astronomican still shone, dimmed but visible, allowing some semblance of normal warp travel to continue. On the far side, in the region that came to be called the Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium, the Astronomican's light was blocked entirely. Navigators could not see it. Ships could not use it to guide their jumps. Entire sectors of the Imperium were cut off from terror, from communication, from reinforcement, from hope. They were alone in the dark, surrounded by enemies, with no way to call for help and no reason to believe help was coming. The Noctis Aeterna, the period of supernatural darkness that followed the rift's opening, was the closest thing to a repeat of the Age of Strife that the Imperium had ever experienced. The psychic light of the Astronomican was dimmed to the point of uselessness. Warp travel became almost impossible. Worlds were isolated. Communications ceased. And through the rift, the demons came, pouring into the material universe in numbers that had not been seen since the darkest days of the heresy. But the Imperium did not break. Not entirely. Guilliman, newly resurrected and restored to his role as Lord Commander of the Imperium's armies, launched the Indomitus Crusade, a massive military campaign to reclaim the worlds lost to the rift's chaos and restore some measure of order to the shattered Imperium. The Astronomican regained some of its strength as the initial shock of the rift's opening faded. Warp travel became possible again, though more dangerous than ever before. The Imperium staggered, bled, lost worlds and armies and populations beyond counting. But it did not die. Since the Great Rift opened, the situation has only deteriorated further. Psykers are being born in greater numbers than ever before. It's a phenomenon known as the Psychic Awakening by some and as the Age of Witches by others. The barriers between the warp and reality are thinner than they have been since the Age of Strife. Demonic incursions are more frequent, more powerful, and harder to contain. The four Chaos Gods are more active, more engaged with the material universe, more focused on breaking down whatever remains of the barriers that keep their full power contained within the immaterium. The very laws of physics have begun to fray at the edges of the Great Rift. Time no longer functions consistently across the Imperium. Some worlds have experienced centuries in what should have been months. Others have been frozen in time, their populations unaware that years have passed in the wider galaxy while only moments passed for them. And still others have suffered constant temporal shifts, their inhabitants living in a state of perpetual disorientation as cause and effect become unmoored from their natural sequence. And through it all, ships still enter the warp. Every day, thousands of vessels across the Imperium activate their warp drives, engage their Geller fields, and plunge into the screaming depths of the immaterium. They do it because they have no choice. Because without warp travel, the Imperium would fragment and die within a generation. Because the alternative to sailing the demon-haunted seas of the immaterium is to sit on a single world and wait for the darkness to come to you. The first explorers found a hostile dimension filled with things that wanted to consume them. And 30,000 years later, absolutely nothing has changed. The warp is still hostile. The things that live in it still hunger. The ships still go in, and some of them still do not come back. The only thing that has changed is the scale. The stakes are higher. The dangers are greater. The margin for error is thinner than it has ever been. And the Great Rift, that screaming wound across the face of the galaxy, serves as a constant, inescapable reminder that the warp is not just an obstacle to be overcome. It is an enemy, the oldest and most powerful enemy that any species in this galaxy has ever faced. An enemy that cannot be defeated, cannot be destroyed, cannot even be fully understood. An enemy that will be there, waiting, hungry, patient, for as long as there are minds to feed it and souls to consume. So here we are, as at the end of a journey that has taken us from the dawn of the galaxy to the 42nd millennium, from the calm, pristine immaterium that the old ones discovered to the screaming, demon-infested nightmare that humanity has been sailing for the last 30,000 years. We have traced the corruption of the warp from its origins in the war in heaven, through the Enslaver plague, the rise and fall of human civilization, the Age of Strife, the Emperor's doomed webway project, and the opening of the Great Rift. We have seen what the first explorers found when they pushed their ships into the abyss, and we have seen how little has changed in all the millennia since. The story of the warp is, in many ways, the story of the entire Warhammer 40,000 universe. It is a story about the consequences of ambition. The Old Ones used the immaterium to build the greatest civilization the galaxy had ever seen, and in doing so, they inadvertently corrupted it beyond repair. Humanity used the warp to build an interstellar empire, and in doing so, they exposed themselves to horrors that have been consuming them ever since. The Emperor tried to bypass the warp entirely through the Webway project, and in doing so, he condemned himself to an eternity of suffering on the Golden Throne. Every attempt to use the warp has come with a price. Every benefit extracted from the immaterium has been paid for in blood and souls and sanity. The first explorers discovered this truth when they lost their first ships in the warp's depths, and every generation since has rediscovered it in its own terrible way. The warp does not give anything for free, yet it is not a tool to be used. It is a predator to be survived, and the predator is patient beyond any mortal reckoning. And yet, humanity keeps going back. Every day, every hour, ships enter the warp and sail its haunted currents, because the alternative, isolation, stagnation, extinction, is worse. That is perhaps the most grimly appropriate aspect of the entire situation. The warp is the single greatest threat to humanity's survival, and it is also the single thing that makes humanity's survival possible. Without it, there is no Imperium. Without the Imperium, there is no protection against the alien, the mutant, the heretic. Without protection, there is only death. It is a trap with no exit, a prison with no walls, a bargain that humanity can neither honor nor break. The first explorers found an ocean with no shore, an abyss that stared back, a dimension of nightmares and madness that wanted nothing more than to consume everything they were and everything they would ever be. And they sailed it anyway, because that is what humans do. They look into the darkness, and instead of turning back, they light a fire and push forward. They know the darkness might swallow them. They know the fire might go out. They know that every moment they spend in the void is a moment borrowed against a debt that will eventually come due. And they go anyway. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there is also the stubborn, irrational, beautiful refusal of a species to accept its own extinction. And as long as that refusal endures, as long as there are navigators willing to open their third eye and stare into the madness, as long as there are crews willing to trust their Geller fields and their prayers and their emperor, the ships will keep sailing into the warp, into the darkness, into whatever waits for them on the other side. That is what the first explorers found, and that is what every explorer since has found: an ocean of nightmares and the courage to cross it. If you enjoyed this journey through the oldest and deepest mystery of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, please do take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you might think, and it means we can keep diving into these incredible corners of the lore together. Whether you are a veteran of the hobby who has been painting miniatures since before the first edition rulebook was printed, or a newcomer who just discovered this universe and wants to know more, why, you are welcome here. This is Q on 40,000, and there is always more to explore. Until next time, keep your Geller fields powered, keep your faith strong, and remember, in the void between the stars, there are things older than memory and hungrier than death. Sail carefully, and with that, we come to the end. But the story, of course, does not end. It cannot end, because the warp is eternal, and humanity's relationship with it is permanent. Every ship that enters the immaterium writes a new chapter. Every navigator who opens their third eye and peers into the churning depths of the Sea of Souls adds another line to a story that began 60 million years ago with the Old Ones, and will not conclude until the last thinking being in the galaxy draws its final breath. The first explorers did not know what they were getting into, and they could not have known. The warp is not something that can be explained in advance. It must be experienced, survived, endured, and even then, the understanding it provides is partial, fragmentary, colored by the very emotions that the warp uses to shape itself. No two people come away from the immaterium with the same understanding of what it is, because the immaterium is different for everyone who enters it, reflecting their own mind back at them in forms that are simultaneously deeply personal and utterly alien. But some things are universal. The feeling of being watched, the nightmares, the nagging, persistent suspicion that the dimension you are traveling through is not merely a medium, but a mind, vast and ancient and attentive, that has noticed your presence and is deciding what to do about it. Well, these experiences connect the first terrified crew that entered the warp 15,000 years ago to the hardened voidfarers of the 42nd millennium. They are the common thread that runs through 30,000 years of warp travel, the one constant in a dimension that defines itself by its inconstancy. The warp is the greatest mystery of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, greater than the Emperor's true origins, greater than the nature of the Catan, greater than the purpose of the Old Ones or the fate of the missing Primarchs. Because the warp is not just a setting element or a plot device, it is the foundation upon which the entire universe is built. Without the warp, there are no Chaos Gods. Without the Chaos Gods, there is no Horus Heresy. Without the Heresy, there is no Imperium as we know it. Without the Imperium, there is no Warhammer 40,000. The warp is the thread that, if pulled, would unravel the entire setting, the one element that connects every faction, every conflict, every story that has ever been told in this universe. And it all started with explorers. Curious, brave, foolish, desperate explorers who looked at the barrier between dimensions and decided to see what was on the other side. They found nightmares. They found madness. They found an ocean that wanted to drown them in their own emotions. And they kept going, because that is what explorers do. They push forward, even when forward leads into darkness, because the alternative is to stand still, and standing still is the one thing that explorers can never do. The warp awaits. It always has. It always will.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.